Hello, what a great pleasure to be with you today. And thanks very much to UFAW and to the organizers, and especially to Hugh and Stephen for inviting me here today. And for this opportunity to talk about what I think is this very interesting idea. And I'm really looking forward to the opportunity of sharing that with you and getting your feedback in the question period. As a teacher at the University of British Columbia, one of the courses I teach, I talk about science communication, and in that element, one of the things that I talk to the students about is the importance of having a good hook. Basically, being able to draw the listener in to your presentation with this with a good hook. And so I thought a little bit about this here, and my hook for today's talk is, this talk is all about probabilities. Okay, maybe that's not such a great hook for those of you that aren't really into probability theory. But I do hope to convince you that this thinking about probabilities and thinking specifically about Bayesian probabilities can transform the way we think about animal welfare, can make us recognize, I think, the importance of some old literature and make us refocus on some new literature and new ideas around animal welfare. And I think it also sets the stage to ask questions about welfare harms, which I think have not been properly considered, and also points to areas for new research. So that's my hope for today. But before we get any further, I wanted to also just tell you a little bit about who I am. And in doing so, one important element is to talk about how my research is funded. For the past 25 years or so, I've been funded mostly by this organization, Canada's Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. And that organization has basically matched the funding that's come mostly from the dairy industry. So partly provided by the dairy farmers themselves, but also by allied industries. And it's important to say that for a couple of reasons, but I think most importantly in today's context is that even though I'm talking about quite a theoretical concept, ultimately I want my work to be applicable. I want to be able to apply it to improve the lives of animals and to also improve the lives of those people who care for animals, including farmers. Okay, I promised you I would talk about probability, and what better way of doing it than starting off with a coin toss. And because I can't be there in person, I've got this cheesy video of me tossing a coin. So here goes. So flip the coin down, there it goes, beautiful. And try to catch it. Yes, he gets it, good. And then with a flourish, what's it gonna be, Dan? Heads or tails? Let's see the result of that coin toss. Ah, it's a tail. Here's a shiny Canadian penny with a beautiful maple leaf on the side. And at this point, maybe some of you are thinking back to your grade 7 math class or whenever it was that you were first introduced to probability theory. And I'm sure your teacher explained to you that, of course, if you haven't already worked it out, the chance if you flip a coin is the chance that it comes up tails is going to be 50% or 0.5. So let's keep on flipping that coin. I won't subject you to the video each time, so you just have to go along with me in this beautiful PowerPoint animation. Then I flip the coin a second time, and you can see, as chance would have it, I've come up with a second tail, and a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time. My goodness, am I on a roll, right? So you get the idea here is this sequence of events. And even though the chance of just one tail is 50-50, if the chance of getting a number of tails in a row becomes quite rare. So in fact, it's going to be 0.5 times 0.5, that's a quarter, times 0.5, that's an eighth, times 0.5, a 16th, times 0.5, that's 1/32. Or another way of expressing that is around 0.03. So if the chance of getting 5 tails is 0.03, then the inverse of that is going to be about 0.96, right? So at this point, you look at this, you say, oh, pretty small probability down. So maybe you're not throwing a fair coin. Maybe my coin doesn't have a head and a tail as we would normally expect, but rather has two tails, right? If I had one of these two-tailed coins, then every time I flip it, it's going to come up tails. And so the chance of 5 tails in a row, well, that's 1, right? So at this point, you're looking at this probability pretty small, this probability is pretty big, and you're thinking, oh, well, maybe if you're a conventional, if you're thinking about probability in a conventional way, you might think that this is an unlikely outcome relative to this. But what the Bayesian would say is, no, you don't just consider the new data. Consider the new data in context of your prior expectations. What are your expectations going into this? In other words, before I showed you the result of even the first coin toss, what do you think the probability was that I had in my hand a normal two-sided penny or this relatively abnormal two-tailed penny? And let's say, so that's Bayes' rule now, that we're going to consider these prior expectations. That's really that's all there is to it, is we take into account the prior expectations when we look at new data. And in this case, let's say the prior expectations are that the chance of these two-tailed coins, well, that's 1 in a million. So the chance of getting one of these coins then is this 0.00001 versus this very high probability of it being a normal two-sided coin. And what Bayes would encourage you to do is now multiply these probabilities. Consider this probability in the context of this larger probability. And when you do that, you see that that number is actually much larger than it is when you look at this very rare outcome, even multiplied by this very high number. So this shows the importance of considering these priors, the prior expectations, in terms of evaluating current data. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is that this isn't just an important concept in probability theory. This is an important concept in animal cognition. I think it has really important ways in terms of how we should be looking at animal welfare. So let's switch to an animal example for those of you that are more interested in animals than in probability theory. And here we have 2 individuals in our group, 2 researchers in our group, Julia and Amandine, and they're pushing this somewhat reluctant heifer into this chute here, as you can see. And a conventional animal welfare approach to this issue would be to let's ask about the cow's experience and ask how that experience is informed by the kinds of things that are happening to it in the moment, its current sensory input. But you'll see immediately from what I've talked about earlier in terms of the Bayesian perspective is that the animal's appreciation of the current data should actually also be informed by its expectations going into the event. So in other words, that we should see the cow's experience as, yes, informed by the current sensory input, but that sensory input is seen in the context of the expectations before any of that data was available. And if we look at a more specific example, then we can think back to Julia and Amandine, and we can say, well, okay, maybe even if the sensory input is relatively neutral, the sight, sound, smells, etc., are not in themselves harmful or scary or painful, that if the animal went into the procedure expecting that it will be unpleasant, that the animal will experience it as unpleasant. So this is really the power of this Bayesian conception of animal welfare. And here's an example with negative expectations, but what if we turn this on its head and look at an example of positive expectations? And the most obvious example of that is the placebo effect, which of course you all know. And the cool thing about the placebo effect is even though the sensory input is by definition 0, we've given the patient just saline or a sugar pill, so there's no meaningful sensory input. Because the patient expects that, let's say in this case, the pain will hurt less, that the patient does indeed experience less pain. So again, the power of this Bayesian context is it allows us to make sense of phenomena like the placebo effect, which otherwise don't make sense if we just look at it from the perspective of sensory input. Okay, hopefully I've got you interested in this idea that these prior expectations are important and need to be studied and are an important component of animal welfare. And with that in mind, and what I want to do is I want to look at it sort of an old idea in the literature and a new idea in the literature, and see how both of those are maybe informed and invigorated by this discussion around Bayesian processing. So first, let's start with the old literature. And I'm going to reach way back now into the beginnings of the literature in experimental psychology, and this classic experiment by Watson and Rayner on little Albert. And little Albert was actually a 9-month-old human infant, and as you'll see, from our modern perspectives around research ethics, this is sort of a cringeworthy experiment, but it taught us a couple of interesting things that we'll get to in a minute. So what Watson and Rayner did is they basically conditioned this 9-month-old boy to fear rats. The way they did that is they started off and they would show young Albert a rat, but also a bunch of other stimuli, which Albert didn't show any fear response to. In fact, some of them, like the rat, seemed quite interested in. But what they did is subsequently, every time they showed Albert that rat, they had this sort of long metal bar in the room, and they would bang that with a hammer. And that made a horrible sort of clanging, banging sound that Albert was, surprisingly enough, very scared of and found quite distressing. And as you can imagine, is over a number of pairings, Albert began to fear the presentation of the rat. So this is fear conditioning, right? Is that initially the stimulus is not fearful, but it's paired with something that is fearful, and then basically the stimulus themselves now, in this case the rat, becomes fear-inducing for young Albert. The other really interesting result from this study was they also found that Albert generalized that fear. So now all of a sudden Albert was not only afraid of the white rat, he was afraid of other sort of small furry animals. He was even afraid when the experimenters put on this sort of Santa Claus, this white beard. This process then is known now as stimulus generalization, that animals and people respond not just to the exact stimuli they were trained with, but also a range of similar stimuli. This aspect of fear conditioning and stimulus generalization together, I think they can have really important and often negative effects on the kinds of experiences that animals have. So let's go back to Julia and Amandine now with that, our heifer. And now we've come to realize that, of course, this heifer is this powerful Bayesian processor, right? So it's taking into account the prior experiences and its expectations, basically, very much informing its current experience. And so in this case, let's say that it's learned to associate maybe Julia and Amandine with something fearful or painful in the past, or maybe it's associated this shoot with something painful or unpleasant in the past, or maybe simply the animals learn to associate other farm workers that dress similarly or behave similarly as being fear-inducing, and therefore is generalizing that kind of response. Either way, or any way you have it, what you see is that this animal's expectations are very much driving the current responses that you see. So even though the current stimuli may be quite neutral, the animal's responses are negative, and that negativity is being driven by the prior expectations going into this. Okay, that's a negative example, but we can just as easily flip this on its side and show a positive example. And in this case, actually, Julia and Amandine are going to show us just exactly that. So here we have Julia just entering the pen. Amandine's actually off on the side of the video at the left-hand side, a little bit out of our field of view. And right in front of us, we have a beautiful new heifer that, in this case, looks really interested in what Julia is doing, and you'll see why in a second. So I'll start the video. Julia closes the gate and she walks in. You can see the heifer's already running over to be let in. Julia opens the entrance and the heifer runs in to come up and approach the gate. And you can see actually the heifer just getting a little food reward from Julia there, and then approaches freely into the headlock. And so you can see now the power of providing, in this case, positive expectations for the animal. The environmental stimuli are identical, right? The only thing that's different is what the animal's prior expectations are going into this event. Now, this is, I said, this is an old idea. And indeed, this training animals so they have positive expectations for events is well used in some aspects of human interactions with animals. I think the zoo environment gives us a number of good examples. I think it's way underused in many other situations, and I'd say, especially on farms, we've got much more opportunity to really think explicitly about what kinds of expectations are we developing in our animals, and working actively to modify those expectations so they're positive, and so then they therefore experience these otherwise neutral events as being much more positive than would otherwise be the case. I said I'd also discuss a more modern idea, and I want to talk about an idea which I think is actually really important in animal welfare, but I think has been up until now maybe not given due attention, and that is the ideas around effectiveness that Franks and Higgins describe. Franks and Higgins are coming from a background in human psychology and interested in human dimensions of wellness, but in this paper, I think make excellent arguments for how those same conceptions can be applied in terms of our understanding of animal welfare. And they're really talking about three main dimensions of effectiveness. And the first of these, value effectiveness, I think is the one which is easiest for us to recognize as sort of traditional animal welfareists. And that's simply, do you have what you want? Do you have access to a warm bed, to some good food, to social companions you want to be with? So this is about sort of, from an animal welfare perspective, providing animals things they want. Okay, very passive notion. The second aspect is more active. So this really relates more closely to ideas around agency, and that is that the animal is able to actually access what it wants. This is what Franks and Higgins call control effectiveness. And this most simply can be thought of is, can the animal, is the animal able to approach the things it wants and to avoid the things it doesn't want, to seek out opportunities basically for good things and to avoid opportunities for bad things. These two concepts fit very nicely within sort of the simple traditional conceptions, sort of the pre-Bayesian model that I showed you earlier, that the animal's responding simply to the sensory inputs. There's good things, the animal's experience is good, and it goes towards those good things. It's the third component of effectiveness, though, that stretches this. So, and that aspect is they call truth effectiveness, and that's about the animal's motivation to learn about its environment, its physical environment and its social environment. And to make sense of that, I think we really need to go to this more Bayesian conception, because this is all really about developing a set of expectations. How do animals learn about the world so they know what to expect? How do they essentially experiment with the world to know what's good and bad? And if you go back to these conceptions of around effectiveness of Franks and Higgins, if you think about it, what you can see is that the entire idea of control effectiveness is sort of a sham if you don't know about the options. You need the truth effectiveness. You need to be able to learn about your environments in order to know what to approach and what to avoid. And I think from that perspective, it really underlines the importance of really thinking about how do animals develop expectations about the world. And I think in a more troubling way is what happens also when the animals are unable to do that. And this, I think, introduces a different type of welfare harm, which is, well, what happens when animals aren't able either to learn about the world or aren't able to access meaningful memories, aren't able to access their prior expectations in order to make good decisions. And I think there's things that we do in animal handling situations in farms and in labs which do sort of blind animals to these expectations, and that can have important welfare consequences, which I think have been under-investigated. Okay. I said I'd leave you with a few ideas around specific kinds of studies that we could do if we were to become Bayesian researchers. So I wanted to just end off with those. And so one and most obviously from the way I started off, is that we need to, as animal welfareists, move beyond just considering stimuli that the animal is currently exposed to, and also consider how the animal's experience is affected by its expectations. So, for example, Benjamin Lacour, a senior PhD student in our group, has just done some beautiful work where he looked at how animals are responding to painful experiences and found out that animals that are more pessimistic, in other words, animals that have negative expectations going into the experiment, tend to show stronger pain responses. So that's definitely consistent with that idea. A second type of issue, I think, is that we need to study how expectations are developed and how this development could be manipulated to improve welfare. I discussed already one nice example of that, which is Julia Loam's beautiful work in terms of training heifers to have more positive expectations of a situation, and how that can really dramatically affect how they respond to a otherwise innocuous event. A third example I'd like to talk about is how we need to do a better job in terms of explicitly understanding this motivation to learn about the physical environment and social environment. And also, I would say, also understand the welfare harms associated with conditions that prevent learning or access to the memories. And I think that's maybe a really an under-researched and understood welfare problem, which I hope we can get to in the years to come. I'd like to just finish by thanking very much my colleagues within the University of British Columbia's Animal Welfare Program who've helped in the development of these ideas, and also, of course, to UFAW for the opportunity to be here with you today. Thank you.